And Mr. President, after today, would you still refer to President Xi as a dictator? This is a term that we used earlier this year.
Well, look, he is. I mean, he's a dictator in the sense that he is a guy who runs a country that is a communist country that's based on a form of government totally different than ours. Anyway, he makes that.
Mr. President, after today, would you still refer to President Xi as a dictator? This is a term that we used earlier this year.
Well, look, he is. I mean, he's a dictator in the sense that he is a guy who runs a country that is a communist country that's based on a form of government totally different than ours.
So before I let you go,
Yeah.
I had to ask you about President Biden at a fundraiser yesterday. These politicians always sort of get caught talking at fundraisers. I don't know if they don't get it yet that, you know, the words that they say at these fundraisers are probably going to get out, even if it's a private fundraiser. But he's talking about Chinese President Xi Jinping. He's calling him a dictator. This is, you know, a day or days, maybe two maximum, after, you know, his own Secretary of State was over there trying to calm things. Can you tell us a little bit about what happened and what the response has been so far?
First of all, we should point out it's not entirely private because they are allowing one or two White House reporters in to hear what he has to say to the group of people before they then leave and the hobnobbing begins in earnest. And so there is a reporter in the room taking notes. And what he said in this one instance in this California fundraiser, he was talking about the Chinese spy balloon, and he suggested that Chinese President Xi Jinping was embarrassed about the details surrounding that balloon and the fact that it drifted all the way across the United States. Quote, that's a great he said that she didn't know about it. Quote, that's a great embarrassment for dictators when they didn't know what happened. Well, the Chinese Foreign Ministry has now weighed in on this, and you can imagine they're not very happy about it. A Foreign Ministry spokesperson saying that the comments in California, quote, go totally against facts and seriously violate diplomatic protocol and severely infringe on China's political indignity. It is a blatant political provocation. China expresses strong dissatisfaction and opposition. That spokesperson added later, the U.S. remarks are extremely absurd and irresponsible. So they're not happy about what he had to say. We should point out the president has called Russian leader Vladimir Putin a dictator as well, even though they actually hold elections in Russia, even though they're not terribly, widely regarded elections. Xi Jinping, of course, is not elected and has seen his power only expand in recent years, but he is called a president, and China clearly not happy about the U.S. president calling him a dictator. Remember, the hope here is for the two leaders to be able to meet later this year in person, either at the Asia-Pacific Economic Conference in San Francisco or on the sidelines of the G20 meeting in India in November. We'll see.
Yeah, we will see. Ed O'Keefe, thank you very much.
Take care.
美方有关言论极其荒谬，极不负责，严重违背基本事实，严重违背外交礼仪，严重侵犯中方政治尊严，是公开的政治挑衅。中方对此强烈不满，坚决反对。无人飞艇事件的是非曲直是非常清楚的，完全是一起由不可抗力导致的意外偶发事件。美方本应冷静、理性、专业的处理，但是美方歪曲事实、滥用武力、升级炒作，充分暴露了美方霸权、霸凌的本性。
But it deals with the more fundamental issue of the rights of the people of East Turkestan to a future in which they can determine their own destiny and that of their country. So I'll explain the nature of the research briefly, the manner in which we address the subject matter, and our preliminary findings. And I say preliminary because we're still working on some of the sections. And so I don't want preliminary findings to be publicized and used as if they were final. The questions we ask are the following. whether the People's Republic of China's claim that Xinjiang, that is, East Turkestan, has been a part of China since ancient times, namely since the Han and Tang dynasty in the 1st century BC, is true, and if so, what this means for the historical status of East Turkestan. Second question we ask is how the answer to that question, to the historical question, affects the current status of East Turkestan and of the rights of the people of East Turkestan. And third, what the obligations and responsibilities of the international community, that is, our governments, and of course of the PRC in the first place, are today as a result of the findings that we hope to confirm. Now, why is this inquiry relevant? Because, and this may be stating it too strongly, but the future of East Turkestan and of the Uyghur people may depend on it. Today, it's essential, obviously, to focus on the crimes against humanity and genocide. And that's why we're here, and that's the most urgent thing, and that's what we need to work on. And I must say that the Uyghur organizations who are here and their supporters are doing an incredible job. It was already said this morning, among others by Kelly, but it is really quite extraordinary how fast and how well this movement has galvanized in the face of the suffering of the people in East Turkestan. But this suffering of your people has lasted over 7 decades, as you know all too well, and it is not going to end unless the cause of the suffering is addressed. That is, the oppression, the oppressive foreign rule against the wishes of the people. And this is a political issue, not only a human rights issue. This is the issue that needs to be addressed and resolved in order for the root cause of the conflict to come to an end. To address the first question then, we are not writing an exhaustive history book on East Turkestan. We limit our analysis to what is relevant to answering the question specifically, whether and if so when East Turkestan can be considered to have been a part of China historically, and whether the PRC can rightfully derive sovereignty over East Turkestan today. And the short answer is that we, and again I'm saying that this is tentative, but we find that East Turkestan was not, since ancient times, part of India, part of China, excuse me. Not sending the wrong message, I hope. This claim that it has historically been part of China since ancient times is simply false. We also find that East Turkestan was historically, in fact, never an integral part of China. And that the fact that Mongol and Manchu empires exercised authority over East Turkestan, and that is undeniable, in no way supports a claim that such authority constituted Chinese sovereignty, or that East Turkestan was in any way incorporated in China. So there's no dispute that the Han and the Tang empires, both Chinese empires, exercised varying degrees of control in the region through the establishment of what they called protectorates. But this accounted for a total of 250 non-consecutive years out of more than 18 centuries of history. And importantly, there was no Chinese staying power. So when these two dynasties were pushed out of East Turkestan, the last one in 763, whatever the position of authority might have been during those dynasties, they were not continued and they were not inherited by future power holders in China. Therefore, the extension of Chinese authority in East Turkestan by the Han and Tang dynasties more than 1,200 years ago, mind you, has no relevance and cannot be used by the PRC to support a claim to sovereignty or ownership over East Turkestan today. That, by the way, is a definitive finding. Since that time, no Chinese empire exercised authority over or in East Turkestan. Uyghur and other powers, all in Asian, did. Two of those powers, specifically the Mongol and the Manchu empires, conquered and also occupied China. The Ming dynasty, of course, was a Chinese dynasty, and it did not extend into East Turkestan. In more recent history, East Turkestan was conquered and ruled as a dependency by the Manchu Qing Empire for two periods, from 1760 to 1865 and from 1881 to 1911. The period in between, as you well know, Yaqub Beg ruled Kashgaria as an independent state and for a time under nominal suzerainty of the Ottoman Sultan or Caliph. Qing control in a moment, very briefly, but first let me point out the fundamental premise that the People's Republic of China uses, its narrative, to prove historical Chinese ownership or sovereignty over East Turkestan, and why that is deeply flawed, misleading, and false in a number of ways. Firstly, the PRC projects the present state of China, that is the PRC, with its current and in some cases expanded borders, into a historical past, and then declares that the territory, that all of that territory has been the same state, the same continued state of China, not just Chinese cultural area, for millennia. And that for millennia, this great multi-ethnic Chinese nation existed, ignoring entirely the historical realities. And by doing so, it declares all non-Chinese peoples who inhabited and inhabit this vast territory to have always been a minority of China. And it labels their kingdoms, their khanats, their empires to have been local regimes under the authority of the central government of China. This is a falsification of history. Secondly, and as a consequence of that reasoning, of that narrative, Beijing conflates China with the dominant empires of Asia, with the inner Asian empires that conquered China. And it appropriates those empires as if they were Chinese, as if they were China. It then invokes and interprets relationships that those foreign empires had with East Turkestan or with polities in the region of East Turkestan as relationships of China with East Turkestan, and uses that as evidence of Chinese sovereignty over East Turkestan. It does that, moreover, by applying modern international law concepts and terminology in a historical and geographic context where it has no place at all. And all of these practices together, or you might call them tricks, are misleading and yield a false rendition of history. A very different picture emerges when we look at who actually ruled East Turkestan at different times in history, at the nature of the empires that did exercise authority in East Turkestan, and that is what we do in our research. And in doing so, we come to the conclusion that except for the Han and Tang dynasty periods, no Chinese empire exercised authority over East Turkestan, and this region was never an integral part of China, as I said. There's no denying that the Qing did exercise varying degrees of authority over much of East Turkestan in the periods that I mentioned earlier. But nothing indicates that East Turkestan became integrated in China, or that that China had sovereignty over East Turkestan. And that is because we need to distinguish between China and the Qing Empire of the Manchus. Of course, as you know, in 1911, the Chinese overthrew the Manchu Empire, the foreign empire, and created their own Chinese state. And for most of that period, East Turkestan was ruled by independently ruled by Chinese generals, and for periods was independent itself, especially the period immediately before the invasion in 1949. So this brings me to the second question, and I'll be very brief with the last two questions, but they're important to mention. What is East Turkestan's status today, and what are the rights of the East Turkestanis? Because this goes to the nature of the rule of China in East Turkestan today. Contrary to what the name implies, East Turkestan, or Xinjiang, as it is called by the Chinese, is not autonomous, but ruled by colonial form of rule. We believe a compelling case can be made that this is a form of colonial rule. And this triggers obligations for China, and it triggers obligations for the international community. The obligation for China is to end its colonial rule. There's an absolute rule in international law that colonialism needs to be ended, that colonial rule has to end by an exercise of the right to self-determination, or as we also call it in our research, the right to decolonization. What obligations does this? Obviously for China, the obligation is to absolutely and immediately end colonial rule. For other members of the international community, for all of our governments, it creates three obligations under international law. The first is to stop recognizing the unlawful continuation of the PRC's colonial rule in East Turkestan, since it violates a fundamental rule of international law. Not to render any assistance in maintaining the PRC's unlawful rule. Not to engage in any activities that deprive the East Turkestan people of their ownership of their territory's natural resources. And it has three positive obligations for our governments to do their utmost in cooperation with others to bring about the decolonization of East Turkestan and to promote the realization of the people of East Turkestan's right to self-determination. Secondly, to render moral and material assistance to the people of East Turkestan in their struggle for freedom. And three, to take measures against actors operating in East Turkestan on behalf of or for the benefit of the PRC that engage in any activities that otherwise enable the PRC to benefit from its continued rule of East Turkestan, including its resources. These are not moral requirements or political ones only, they are legal requirements. Thank you.
We would like to thank Professor Michael van Wald from Prague for his excellent
stop the genocide! Jinping, stop the genocide! Jinping, liars! Jinping, Waterless!
Well, China has lashed out at Germany after its foreign minister described Chinese President Xi Jinping as, quote, a dictator. Beijing has branded the comment as extremely absurd and even considered it an open political provocation.
中方对德方的有关言论强烈不满，坚决反对。德方言论极其荒谬，严重侵犯中方政治尊严，是公开的政治挑衅。中方已通过外交渠道向德方提出严正交涉。
German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock called Mr. Xi a dictator last week during her live interview with Fox. Now, she was stressing the importance of Ukraine winning the war as a firm signal to leaders like Russian President Vladimir Putin. Beijing is Berlin's top trade partner, but ties remain complicated. Germany published its comprehensive strategy towards China in July, identifying it as a partner, competitor and systemic rival. Now, this isn't the first time Mr. Xi has been called a dictator. Barely 3 months ago, US President Joe Biden made a similar jab at the Chinese leader during a fundraising event. It was just one day after Secretary of State Antony Blinken met with Xi Jinping in Beijing for talks aimed at stabilizing ties. Now, China condemned President Biden's remark in language similar to what it used today, describing it as absurd and an open political provocation.
If you like this video, then like, share and subscribe to Mirror Now.
细的泪我爱你，深深的爱着你，扎西的泪我爱你不分离，扎西的泪我爱你，深深的爱着。
This venture you propose is risky and somewhat